Good evening and welcome everyone to the 9th installment of the European Asia webinar series, jointly organized by the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies and the Stockholm Center for South Asia and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, or ISDP. My name is Isak Nordenberg, and it's my pleasure to serve as your moderator today alongside Jagannath Panda. I'm an event and activity support officer at YCAPS and a recent graduate student from Sweden, and I'm delighted to welcome a participant joining us from across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Before we begin today's discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce the organization behind this webinar. YCAPS is a non-profit organization based in Yokosuka, Japan, dedicated to fostering deeper understanding of Indo-Pacific affairs through public seminars, fellowships, strategic dialogue, and educational programming, engaging experts, practitioners, military personnel, and the broader public. ISDP is an independent Stockholm-based research and policy institute focused on promoting dialogue, research, and policy engagements or issues relating to security, conflict, and development across Asia, Europe, and the wider Indo-Pacific region. Today's session, titled Hormuz 2030, the next great choke point, examines one of the world's most strategically vital maritime corridors at a time of increasing geopolitical uncertainty. The Strait of Hormuz remains a critical artery of the global economy, facilitating roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade, yet the region is also becoming an area of intensifying strategic competition involving Iran, Israel, the United States, as well as growing interest from China and Russia. Against this backdrop, questions surrounding maritime security, energy resilience, freedom of navigation, and regional stability have become increasingly urgent. Today's discussion will explore whether Hormuz is likely to remain a stable and open waterway, or whether risks evolving into a recurring flashpoint with global consequences for trade, supply chains, and international security. We will also discuss how actors such as Japan, India, and the European Union may respond to these evolving challenges. So before introducing our speakers, just a quick housekeeping note. Please feel free to submit questions to the webinar by writing them in the chat, and we will address them during the Q&A section. If possible, kindly indicate which speaker your question is directed toward. That'll help us during the discussion portion. Also, a friendly reminder to please keep your microphones muted throughout today's sessions to avoid interruptions during the recording and presentations. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists for today. Captain Sarabjeet Parmar served in the Indian Navy from 1987 to 2023, commanding 2 ships and frontline anti-submarine warfare helicopter squadron. He later held senior strategic and research positions at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis and the National Maritime Foundation. His work focuses on maritime strategy, Indo-Pacific security, and maritime law and regional security dynamics. Mark S. Cogan is an associate professor of peace and conflict studies at Kansai Gaidai University in Osaka, Japan. His research focuses on security, peace building, counterterrorism, and human rights across Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. A former United Nations communications specialist, he has published widely in both academic and policy outlets, including The Diplomat, East Asia Forum, and South China Morning Post. Dr. Małgorzata Bonikowska is president of Center for International Relations, a Polish think tank specializing in international affairs and European policy, an expert on international relations and EU affairs. She has served as a government consultant, academic, and policy advisor. She has authored more than 150 publications and studied at institutions including the University of Warsaw, Sorbonne, Columbia University, and Columbia University as a Fulbright scholar. And so, with that, I thank you all once again for joining us today, and I will now hand over the floor to you, Jagannath.
Thank you, Isaac. Great pleasure to be here and moderating this session with this esteemed panel, Isaac. And also thanks to Vetore for all the logistical support. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm based in Stockholm. My name is Jagannath Panda. I head the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs in ISDP, and we have this great collaboration with YCAPS on the Europe-Asia series. So glad to have you, and glad to also particularly have all the distinguished 3 speakers, Captain Parmar, Dr. Mark Cogan, and Dr. Małgorzata Bonikowska. So let me start, I think, by saying that, today we'll be discussing about Strait of Hormuz. This has been in the news for some time now, not only for the war per se, but also the kind of approaches different countries have, pursued with regard to this particular strait. And we know for a fact that what happened recently, it does indicate that the Strait of Hormuz is probably no longer merely an energy corridor. And if we look at the kind of immediate future, the kind of scenarios are emerging, we could clearly say that probably the Strait of Hormuz is a strategic theater where maritime security, energy geopolitics, and great power competition are kind of increasingly getting intersect with each other. As we know that probably roughly a quarter of world's oil and energy passes through this choke point, and making it to be one of the critical choke points of the global economy. So, in that context, how should we see the Strait of Hormuz in the immediate future, if not really in a distant future, at least given the dynamics of these conflicts, given the dynamics of this choke point? I will invite each one of you to comment for 5 to 7 minutes initially, that in the immediate future, let's say by 2030, do you really see the Strait of Hormuz evolving into a kind of a managed global commons, and will be able to manage all of these conflicts, pressures, and the conflicts that is arising? Or it is still going to be one of those contested choke point in times to come with a lot of disruptions? How do you really see this? And what are the indicators really emerging out of it? If you could comment. And also, I would invite each one of your comments trying to link it with the current war. We know that there is a effort is being made about the ceasefire, which is still ongoing. Despite of the ceasefire, there are still tensions. But then, how does the Strait of Hormuz really, particularly the stability of this strait point, is linked with the broader Iran-Israel-US war or their power dynamics? If you could comment initially, and then we'll go for further discussion. So I'll first invite you, Sarabjeet, and then Mark, and then Dr. Bonikowska. So over to you, Sarabjeet, for 5 to 7 minutes.
Yep. Thank you, Jagan. I think it's an important point you raise, is that if we go by the buzzword of maritime commons, the definition indicates that it is obviously commons for everybody. But in this case, the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, how many nations get impacted by it, and how many would like to get involved in a debate or say keeping the strait open? Because most countries at some point in time will face the conundrum of a strait issue. For example, in the Indian Ocean region itself, we have some 11 choke points starting from the Cape coming around the whole IOR up to the Mumbai and Veta Straits. So therefore, whatever is happening in this region today sets off a bit of a precedence, which other nations may like to copy, emulate, or, raise the risk options of keeping transit passage open. The whole problem that occurs, it's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, is that there are two nations through whose maritime zones the strait moves. And one of them is in conflict with the US and Israel right now. So that complicates the issue, especially also the fact that when you look at UNCLOS, and you have the US and Israel who have neither signed nor ratified UNCLOS, the main document, and you have Iran who has signed but not ratified. So therefore, they are all presenting their own points, the way they look at it. By and large, if this is, you said 2026, I think it's too far in the future to look at. We need to understand that what is it that the world actions are going to take place. Are we going to sort of debate the issue of UNCLOS and try to push forward the articles? There is no enforcement mechanism available. So how do you ensure that the transit passage remains open? And do remember, transit passage was in a way never stopped in the earlier days of the conflict. It's just that the maritime shipping stopped moving because of certain insurance issues, one. And secondly, the fear of erroneous targeting. Whether it would have been, intentionally or erroneous, we'll have to see that much later. And especially when you have neutral shipping, it becomes more complicated as in the case here. So what we're seeing right now is perhaps you can call it a clash or a conflict between the laws of armed conflict and UNCLOS. So UNCLOS essentially talks about peacetime because UNCLOS doesn't talk about conflict. The laws of armed conflict talk about how do you, engage in conflict, and the San Remo manual is very clear what nations have to do. So the question here is that which law are we going to push forward? Is it going to support UNCLOS, or are you going to look at the laws of armed conflict? For the US, Israel, and Iran, presently the laws of armed conflict would reign supreme over the UNCLOS. So this is an issue that nations need to examine and decide how are you going to put these bricks in place to avoid a situation in the future. Look for a solution for shipping to safely transit the Strait of Hormuz. Now, whether it's a question of nations positioning warships, India has already started doing it. We are escorting our ships out. China has positioned, it's positioned one of their best, modern destroyers with 64, if I remember correctly, vertical launch missile silos. And of course, then you have Japan, who's also maybe presenting its own escort force to sort of protect its own shipping. And South Korea may jump in because these are the two economies of the Indo-Pacific whose actual sustenance and energy pipeline comes from the Strait of Hormuz. India, for its own part, has diversified a little bit insofar as oil is concerned, but gas is an issue for us. And then we are having issues in the country on the issue of LPG, right? So 2026 is too far off. I think we need to look for a situation of how to ensure that the ships that are presently stuck in the Strait of Hormuz come out to ensure that the supply chains continue to feed the economies, one, and secondly, on the humanitarian basis of the people who are stuck there need to come out. And thereafter, how do you continue? There are alternates. You've got the Saudi Arabian pipeline coming across to Yanbu. You have UAE, which is a different factor that UAE is now withdrawn from one of the most important agreements that was ever looked at as far as oil and gas was concerned. They also had another pipeline that opens out into the North Arabian Sea. Now, my understanding is that the Yanbu pipeline has been targeted. Saudi Arabia, of course, the Houthi actions sort of restricted the movement of Saudi tankers through the Red Sea from that oil. So we are not only looking at the Strait of Hormuz, we got to also look at the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab and ensure that that does not choke itself. It doesn't get choked. It's like the Strait of Hormuz is concerned. Is there a problem? There is. Do we have a solution in hand? We don't. The margin for error is reducing. Can you imagine a standoff, say, between the PLA Navy and the US Navy, or for that matter, the Iranian Navy and the Indian Navy, when it comes to escorting other ships out? So we're looking at perhaps a conflict that may expand a bit, but that's an issue. And I think I'll stop here so that we can get in some more points.
Thank you. I think those are excellent remarks. And your point, particularly, there is no enforcement mechanisms available, which makes the things complicated in the regions. We will come back to you. And with this, before I invite Mark and Małgorzata, let me also say that please also have a look at the Q&A box. And I would also request my colleague Isak to read some of these questions and comments in the second and third round, so that we could address some of these questions. But now let me invite Mark to have your initial remarks for 5 to 7 minutes. You have been following history, you have been following UN and many international regimes. So how do you really see this complexity in the immediate near future, and what really history tells us about the Strait of Hormuz conflict at this moment?
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to speak. I had a chance about 10 years ago to actually live in the Middle East and speaking to people who were in the city of Amman, Jordan. This was during the Syrian refugee crisis, and speaking to people who were Syrians, people who were Palestinians, and lots of people who lived in Amman, which was a very multicultural city. Is that the consensus was back then that Americans or the West simply don't understand the dynamics of the Middle East. And it's just far too complicated, intricate for casual observers, perhaps even academics, to think about. Um, and I think, having said that, there is a lingering fantasy in the West that um, regime change, that Iran, the Iranian regime, which has been in power since 1979, is something that could easily be removed. And there's a fallacy in the West that these very, very complex systems of institutions and religious organizations and civil society groups and informal ad hoc organizations and we call them terrorist groups or militias will vanish overnight when the regime collapses. But history tells us that that is fantasy and it's pure fiction. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but external pressure that the United States has placed on Iran, that's dating back to the sanctions era, that's dating back to the nuclear agreement, to um, many different sort of mechanisms that have isolated the regime, haven't worked. It does not catalyze regime change, and there's no way that this would lead to a fundamental positive difference in Iran. And you can look at, for example, Israel's war in Lebanon in 1982. That failed to dislodge the PLO and Hezbollah. You can look at Afghanistan in 2001, where essentially there's a huge multinational force. The UN was very much involved. And here in Japan, Japan was involved in DDR efforts, leading to disarmament and reintegration platforms. Um, they were not prepared for a long, protracted war. And when it got too uncomfortable, too hard, too dangerous, too expensive in 2021, they withdrew. And look what happened to Afghanistan now. Uh, Iraq, 2003. Uh, there's evidence that after the U.S. withdrawal in 2011, Iraq has maintained very little stability under al-Maliki, and that institutions are fractured. There's very, very deep divisions between Shia and Sunni Muslims and Kurdish communities, and that the fragmentations that occurred in Iraq has led to extremism. The rise of ISIS and other groups in Western Iraq, in areas that are essentially ungovernable. Although, ISIS has been defeated, and I think that was done in 2017. Iraq itself is plagued by institutions that are not only weak, they have been compromised by Iranian influence and periodic protests because Iraq can barely govern itself. And then you could look back to Libya, for example, after NATO. What happened when we tried to depose or get rid of Gaddafi? We have protracted instability, fragmentation along tribal, regional, and ideological lines. And now what happens in Libya? You have two competing fractured governments, a UN brokered administration, and some kind of rival authority under a military commander. This brought in a kind of proxy war, a civil war that drew in what? Russia, Egypt, Turkey, the UAE. And it took Libya's oil economy, flattened it, and created failed institutions, and we have a lingering humanitarian and political crisis in Libya. So with that said, Iran, absent the regime, would likely produce a very, very similar result. And I would like to say that there has been instability in the Strait of Hormuz for a very, very long time. And this was something that Iran knew. There were attempts by the United States and the Iranians to renegotiate the nuclear deal. They tried in 2025, they tried earlier this year, and they were very, very unsuccessful. But I think that the United States is the one that has made the most serious damage. And to use a kind of cliche that I use in my classes, we broke it. We kind of took we broke Humpty Dumpty, and we're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We have shaken the political status quo in Iran, and we have underestimated the regime's ability to want to survive, to need to survive, and the kind of desperate aims it's willing to go through, attacking allied oil targets, oil infrastructure, drone strikes, that so-called mosquito fleet that's now operating in the Strait of Hormuz, preparations to mine the strait with these very, very small vessels, the asymmetric warfare that's going on. So this status quo, the managed sort of careful status quo, is now disrupted. And the question is, and this is a very, very difficult question to answer, I think, what will bring both the United States and Iran back to the negotiating table? And I think what's really happening here is that Iran has so much of an advantage, so much maneuverability, because this is a war, this is a conflict that was started and it was exacerbated by the United States, by strategic mistakes by the United States. And Iran knows that it does not have to win. It just simply has to delay, to disrupt, to force the Americans into a position of weakness, to get Donald Trump, to a certain extent, to capitulate to weaker and weaker terms. Right. There are lots of different studies out there, and I think there's a book by Robert Pape. There's a number of academic journal articles that say, look, political sanctions don't work. They've never worked. And nor do air campaigns, nor do these incursions with the hope of bringing about a better result. An air war. I think there was the Robert Pape book is called Bombing to Win. I think he wrote it in 2002. It's proven time and time again that these things don't work. And I think what you're going to see over the next several months is the United States taking any and whatever best opportunity can to pull itself out, looking for an exit in hopes that it sort of saves political capital in the United States and returns, to a certain extent, whatever is left of the status quo that it broke. And I think I spoke for like 6 minutes. If that's what you want. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I think those are really excellent points that you have made, particularly the point that you actually brought out the rise of extremism part, and then you talked about the Shia Sunni, the ethnic dimensions, which are really very valid in the context of what's going on in the regions and what could be the likely impact on the Strait of Hormuz. And your point about raising about history, that history gives us so much lessons to review and learn from that. We will come back. I'm sure there will be some questions, but let me now invite Małgorzata. How do you really see more from European point of view? You have been watching some of these conflicts very closely, and particularly you have seen some of the conflicts in India, in the subcontinent, in South Asia, being an India and well-known Asia specialist. How do you really see the future of Strait of Hormuz in the immediate longer run? And has really Europe seen these conflicts from its own point of view? How Europe is responding and looking at the regions? If you could throw some of the lights, that would be really useful for our discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm heard well.
You're just fine.
So I actually mix my experience as a professor at Warsaw University Center for Europe, but also my practical activity as a leader of a think tank called the Center for International Relations, and I'm also advisor to the European Commission and to the Polish government. So let me divide it into two sections. First, what we see happened, and second, maybe some conclusions what may happen in the future. Europe was shocked by this action, first of all. We see it as something which was not, first of all, consulted with us, while we are the American allies in NATO. So we saw it as a very surprising move that for the first time, such action from the American president was not even mentioned, that consultancy with the other allies. Second is we see it as something which was not definitely well analyzed. And then we have a lot of questions concerning American system today under this president. Such as how the institutions work around the president, why the president was not informed fully about the consequences, or if he was informed, why he didn't take it into consideration, why he did not have Congress approving this, etc., etc. So this is like a pretext for us in Europe to discuss the situation, internal situation in the United States, which is obviously for Europe absolutely crucial because our own situation and our own security challenges, especially taking into consideration that NATO is to protect Europe against threats, against dangers, existential dangers, which is for us now not the Hormuz Strait and Iran, which is now for us Russia. But because of this situation, we have a lot of questions concerning our main ally, which is United States, and this country's behavior towards the others and also towards us, because NATO was very affected by this conflict in Iran, because obviously we took a position that because we were not consulted, we shouldn't be involved. So that's the second point, that NATO is not involved, nor any European country directly, but Americans expect us to be involved, and the US president expects NATO to help. So this is not directly, but indirectly poses a lot of questions to what we should do in such situations. And the European countries are divided into reacting to this challenge. There were some European countries and NATO members who agreed that Americans can use the bases. For example, Portugal gave a base in Madeira for the operation in the Gulf. UK is not in the EU, but obviously it's in NATO, accepted that. But while, for example, Spain said definitely not possible. So in Europe, there is also a very big discussion how to react to this pressure. And as you maybe heard, that Donald Trump also said that NATO, because of the passive reaction, should be punished by US for example, by withdrawing some American soldiers, which was already announced vis-à-vis Germany. Germany was also saying no, which deteriorated relations between Chancellor of Germany, Merz, and personally Trump. So all these consequences are deep in our situation.
Yeah.
Third thing we have to mention that obviously for us, we are angry about all this situation because it makes our own neighborhood less visible in the world, especially the war in Ukraine. It was somehow covered by another war, and all the media, news agencies, and even the attention of the politicians and the world opinion, public opinion, is now concentrated on the Gulf, on the Strait of Hormuz. While we have still the war in Ukraine, it's more than 4 years which has been going on, and there is no end to it. So even the attention of Donald Trump is much less regarding the negotiations with the Russians about the war in Ukraine. So from our perspective, obviously, it's another war which could have been avoided. And this would have been our advice to Donald Trump if he consulted the Europeans, but it was not done. And now we have an extra problem.
Yeah.
As far as direct consequences, Europe is not so badly hit by Hormuz Strait blockade as the Asians, much less than China, much less than Japan, much less than South Korea. A European average import from the strait of oil and gas is around 5%, but that's average. Some countries are more hit, like my own country, Poland. We import gas from Qatar, and our national situation is more dangerous in the sense that our import from Qatar is 20% of our gas resources. So much more than the EU average. With oil, Europe is a little bit more, importing more. It is roughly average from the Gulf countries around 15%. However, not all of this goes through the strait. We import from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, but that goes on the other side of the Gulf, so we are not so badly hit. However, all the situation we see as a big challenge for the future. And now I move on to the consequences in the long run. What Europe expects would be, number one, politically speaking, that America became weaker globally because it proved to be unpredictable and it proved to be misled and also led by Israel. Because from our analysis, the American decision was very much basing on Israel. And what was in interest of Israel, maybe directly, it was not necessarily in the interest of the United States in this particular case, but America did it. So to our understanding, the whole reading of what will be American position globally is that it is weakening, and very much so also in the eyes of the Gulf countries. Obviously, America is still the most powerful country, both for Europeans and for the Gulf countries from the security point of view. But in a long run, I think the Gulf countries will follow very much the logics the Europeans have been already demonstrated, meaning that we cannot trust 100% American guarantees. Because in the moment of proof, Americans may not deliver. And that's exactly thinking in the Gulf. Obviously not for now. Now we cannot say much, but in the long run, we will try, the Europeans are trying, and also the Gulf countries, I think, will try to do something about this discovery. That's one. Second is, obviously, it opens the question if America is not so definitely number one in the region, what will be the reconfiguration of the activities of the other powers? So we are expecting much more attention of China because China is very badly hit by the Gulf blockade. As far as the Europeans, we know that there is an expectation Europe should be more engaged. And we think also that that's the case. However, as of now, we are not able to do it. But we see it as a weakness of Europe. We ourselves see it that we, let's say 10 years ago, we were able to be very constructive in negotiating the deal with Iran. This was basically negotiated by the Americans, the Europeans, but Europe played a very constructive role, especially the EU External Action Service under the leadership of Baroness Ashton at that time. So Europe was able to be constructive and negotiate the deal and conclude the deal, while 10 years later, Europe is not active. So we see it as that we have to do something about ourselves in the nearest future to be back, to be able to react in such situations. Number three, we obviously expect consequences for Iran. Iran seems to be stronger, so we don't expect this regime to go anywhere, which is a pity because no one is happy about it. So we believe that the European way of handling Iran was better. Negotiations, dialogue, the deal. Now the American way of treating Iran is worse. It brings more problems, and Iran, the regime there, will most likely be stronger, not weaker, which is a pity also for the Iranians as a population. It's a wonderful nation. And now we don't really see any way of getting out this regime from this country. And for Israel, it obviously means that Israel became the strongest country locally. So we expect that Israel will play the most important role as far as hard power in the region, taking over from the Americans, most likely in the long run, which changes the dynamics, obviously, and it can have consequences. It blocks, most likely, in a very serious way, the space of maneuver for the Arab countries, because Israel, being the strongest, has already gone for a radical. It's radicalized, and what we see in Israel is not just the country who wants to make a balance in the region, but the country who wants to expand. And the attacks on Lebanon, taking over Gaza, and all that, seems that the Israeli government, at least under Netanyahu leadership, will try to build one strong country with different borders than it used to have, which poses a lot of other questions for the region. And finally, we Europeans are afraid of another long-term conflict such as Syria. And we know what it means for us, massive migrations. So this is a fear that in some time Europeans have again to confront a lot of migrants from the south to Europe. So we are worried about the new consequences for us as far as this regard. Migration is a very tricky subject in Europe, and it can bring a lot of political turmoils. Just look at the latest polls in Germany. Alternative for Deutsche is winning all the surveys. Even in the UK, which is far away, the Farage's party got now a huge victory in local elections. We will have next year elections in France for the presidency. So Europeans expect that the new migration wave could create a new big problem for the current governments and could influence our political scene in the most important countries of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are a really interesting point, Małgorzata, and I think your point about the kind of perception initially appeared from European side that it was really a surprising decision on the part of the United States of America, and also what is more surprising was that there is an expectation that Europe should stand with the US, and I think that is really baffling because the same kind of expectation was expected from many of the Asian countries, including from India. So and also the kind of overshadowing the Ukraine war is an interesting point to discuss because we need to talk about one particular war, which has really been a protracted kind of a war for a long time. But the world has suddenly seems to be overlooking the Ukraine war and talking about only the Gulf kind of tensions that is prevailing right now. But with this note, let me have a little sharp reactions to each of these three speakers on a point that would be really interesting in the context of discussion. Already, I could see there are some Q&A questions, which I would invite my colleague Isak to read. But a very sharp, maybe a very short 2 minutes reaction from each one of you. How do you really see China and Russia looking at Strait of Hormuz in the near and future context? And what are their differentiating point when it comes to this particular war? Because it might appear that China and Russia are on the same league when it comes to the war, but I believe there is a huge difference in their outlook, the way they look at the current war, and also towards the Strait of Hormuz, because Russia doesn't really probably need that much energy resources the way China need it. So I would invite each one of your brief comment before we read the questions. I would invite Isak, but I'll start with you, Sarabjeet, and then Mark and Małgorzata, just for a brief, sharp reaction in 2 minutes, probably.
I think for Russia, this is an opportunity on two fronts. One is resumption of gas supply as was in the older days to Europe, because Europe, as you know, as Dr. Bonikowska also said, that the gas intake from Qatar is going to reduce. There is damage to the refinery and damage to other oil refineries also, which will take time to come back up. So for Russia, two advantages. One is export of gas again and oil to the countries who need it as an alternate source of supply. Yep. And more importantly is that it may see it as an opportunity to get the United States bogged down in the Persian Gulf as itself has got bogged down in Ukraine. How it plans to do that is yet to be seen. That's the Russian angle. For China, I think it's more important to understand that China obviously will have to look for alternate sources of supply. Venezuela has already been cut off in one way. Now you've got the Persian Gulf being cut off. But for China, there's another advantage. It's got a ringside view to see how efficient, how good, or how bad are its munitions and equipment that it has supplied to Iran. I mean, after Op Sindhu last year with Pakistan, India, it got an understanding of how good or bad its systems were. Similar is going to happen in Iran. The other advantage China is going to take from this ongoing conflict is that it's also got a deep insight onto how the US will operate, how the US will use its equipment, and more importantly, how other nations who have US equipment will use and operate. Yeah. And this is something that it may template in the South China Sea when it comes to Taiwan. Yeah. Insofar as gas and oil is concerned, I think they're already looking for alternate supplies. It also gives China the legitimacy to increase its footprint in the Persian Gulf, especially maritime, something like it did in piracy. And so therefore, these I'll just stop there, Jagan. So we can have a look.
So no, interesting comment, Mark.
Yeah, well, I first start with Russia, and I echo everything that the captain has said. But I think that Russia benefits from this, obviously, because it gets to act in two different ways. It provides to a certain extent Iran diplomatic cover because it has positioned itself as a kind of mediator, and it acts as a kind of veto against potential resolutions. It already has partnerships with with China and Iran. They've participated in maritime security drills in the Strait of Hormuz, and it benefits in another way because it's already forced the United States to waive sanctions that they didn't want to waive. And that was this thing called General License 134B. And that allowed basically Russian oil tankers to deliver cargo, oil that had already been basically delivered and sold from somewhere between like mid-April to basically the 16th of this month. And Trump had to position himself as saying, hey, this is necessary because we want to prevent a disruption in global energy supply that we ourselves caused. And the Ukrainians, to a certain extent, well, to a large extent, are saying, hey, this is a really, really bad idea because the more that you capitulate to Moscow because of you caused this problem, it funnels billions of dollars in revenue to fund the Russian war machine. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. For China, I think this is a very, very favorable environment because China has very, very good relations with the Iranians, and they have been dialoguing quite often with the Iranians. They were the first people to talk directly with Iran and move Chinese ships through the Strait of Hormuz, while at the same time it has made maneuvers to dispatch ships from its base, that fancy naval base in the Horn of Africa. So it accomplishes two really, really important objectives. It deters the United States and Israel, and it also um, asserts a kind of physical presence, which the Chinese have not been able to assert yet. Uh, a physical presence of Chinese ships as a deterrent to large-scale naval operations by the United States. So on one hand, it wins diplomatically because it has existing relationships in the region. It's a very effective partner, actually, for Iran. And it, as the captain basically says, it gets to test the United States. And it also, as I'm adding here, it tests its own capacity and its own ability to secure itself and to deter actions by the United States.
Very useful context points in the context of our discussion. Over to you, Małgorzata, for a quick comment.
Trying to
You are muted.
unmute.
You are muted. Yeah.
Am I muted now?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear
now
you.
You hear
Please
me?
go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, well, I pretty much agree what was already said. I can add maybe some more elements. As far as China, I think first China gains globally from this conflict as a perception, because obviously it's hit directly by the problem of Hormuz Strait blocked. So I agree that China most likely will reorganize the purchases and will buy more from Russia. And also maybe in the long run, China will definitely speed up the energy transformation inside China. They are going green. Don't forget that China still uses most of the coal in the world, but China also in the same time invests the highest amount of money in the green transformation. Just first of all, to be independent because of a lack of enough resources. So I think that pushes China to speed up this process even more, which is, by the way, a very interesting thing to observe for the Europeans, because we are having very similar situation. So, but in the long run, China gets in a perception because it seems another superpower like the United States, but this superpower is predictable. This superpower is stable. And this power can handle the situation in a different way. Instead of hitting or invading, China can enter into constructive dialogue. Also because in the Gulf, China already started doing it. And don't forget about agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran itself. China mediated at the final stage. So in a way, this perception of China is growing. It will take a while, obviously, but less America is seen as a predictable superpower, more China gains. Also because China is presenting itself as a power, as a superpower, which wants multilateralism to continue, which US is destroying. because US is violating the laws.
Mm.
You cannot have a global superpower with a perception of being, a kind of a seriously treated ally, or the world policeman, like the US was positioning itself, when you yourself violate the rules you yourself want the others to follow. While China is presenting itself as the superpower which wants to follow the rules, and which wants to support also the multilateral organizations, which, by the way, are completely neglected by Trump. He's against it, and he doesn't want even to bother. So United Nations, for example, while China in the same time just does the opposite, right? As far as Taiwan, China can profit because it's already seen that the government of Taiwan changed the approach towards China. Why? Because they obviously cannot be certain about American support. If they have doubts what the Americans will do if China does any hard action against Taiwan, they changed the strategy and they started talking to Beijing in a very soft way.
Right.
So it's a complete political U-turn in Taiwan itself. I think they think that in the long run there will be no other way. They have to somehow deal with Xi Jinping. It's better to deal in a passive way, peaceful way, than just to be invaded, right? As far as Russia, obviously I agree that they profit with the higher oil and gas prices. But I think what is important is for Russia is that, first of all, they are giving moral support not only to Iran, but also to all these countries who think that this kind of action by America is unbearable, that it has to be punished. So all the countries who think that Iran was attacked without really a very concrete reason, Russia says, yes, you are right. So Russia is gaining like a moral, moral position, which was lost in case of Russia because of attack on Ukraine. And don't forget, just a couple of years ago with Biden mobilized a huge coalition of democratic states against, against Russia, in the sense that he wanted to show that actually the world is divided into two: those who are good and those who are bad. Those who are bad means obviously Russia. There was a failure, but generally America wanted to be seen as a country who supports good cause, right? Who punishes the evil, and the evil in this narrative was Russia. Now there is no way you could do it, because in what way US is different from Russia? US did actually the same thing to Iran like Russia did to Ukraine. Forget the reasons. I'm just talking about the principles, right?
Of course.
From this point of view, that this moral position of Russia could be back, maybe not to normal, but it's a leverage for Russia. Russia can use it by saying, okay, we are, the same country as the US as far as we are a superpower, but we behave, maybe you can criticize us, but why only us? You just criticize the United States. So it's a completely
kind of a tough
different
sell.
model. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think a very interesting point that, what Russia did to Ukraine, US did the same to Iran. I think that's why probably we don't really see that the logic behind the rules-based order is still prevalent, because if this is going to be the norm of the day, that a major power can attack a minor power, then there is no rule, or we are not really living in a world which really believes in any kind of rules or regulations or norms or morality. So with this note, let me invite Isak to read some of these questions. I could see a number of comments and good questions coming up. Isak, I would request maybe we could divide it into two parts. Maybe you could club it 3 to 4 questions in one group, and then we could go for a second round.
Yeah, sure. Of course. So I'd like to start off maybe with a question of my own. So I was wondering, because of the recent crisis have highlighted the vulnerability of shipping lanes and insurance markets to the instability of the Gulf. Are economic tools such as sanctions, shipping restrictions, and insurance pressure becoming a sort of strategically important as military deployments in Hormuz, or have sanctions lost their ability to put pressure on states such as Iran or Russia, considering both states have been able to sort of absorb the economic pressures put on them? That's one question. And then I had a great question from Elif here. Thank you for joining us, Elif. As a Turkish political scientist, I see the current Hormuz crisis as a repetition of myopic goals setting by the US in the Middle East that once again ignores the dynamics of the region. As you mentioned, the previous attempts to bring the regime change failed and instead entrenched the rulers. Syria may be argued as a counterexample, but I believe the Assad regime was brought down thanks to limited US involvement. So can we say that pursuing a rational and bounded involvement in the Middle East provides better result? And then we had a question about the historical roots here. For Cogan, you already touched on the historical roots and the instability of the Middle East. And in the case of Iran, do you think that an honest assessment of today's tensions should also include Western-backed overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953? Many see it as the beginning of the political spiral in Iran, from the derailment of a democratic development to the consolidation of the Shah's authoritarian rule and the repression associated with the Savak. Do you think the historical context is sufficiently acknowledged in Western policy and security discussions?
So which question?
Yeah. So let's reverse the order maybe. I mean, you could pick and choose probably. Then we could invite each one of you to comments in 5 minutes maybe. So I'll start probably. Let's start with Małgorzata and then Mark and then Sarabjeet.
Okay.
Over to you, Małgorzata.
Okay, so as far as because I'm also reading the questions stuff. As far as the calculations for Iran, well, countries of Central and Eastern Europe constantly remember the sources, the origins of the problem of Iranian revolution. It was the reaction on a very tough regime of Shah. And by the way, half of Europe was under the Soviet bloc, and like including my own country, Poland. And during all these 40 years, we had a completely different position and opinion to the Western Europeans, which brought us to many different choices. Like, for example, we were one of the first to acknowledge existence of Palestinian autonomy, while France or UK were completely against it at that time. We are talking about 70s, 80s. And the same way we were quite, our elites at that time were very much against Shah regime and also quite in favor of the Iranian revolution in 79 as an act of being against the Shah. Obviously, no one expected the regime of Ayatollahs to change into this direction. But in our region, in the Central and Eastern Europe, is very much remembered the origins. While in the West, obviously, and especially in countries like the UK, who was directly involved with the Americans in Mossadegh coup d'etat, it's hard to tell. It's not really a very largely discussed fact. The attention is concentrated on the current regime, and obviously here Europe speaks in one voice. No one likes this regime. No one wants this regime to continue. But as I said, now we see less possibilities to change than earlier. By the way, we also think as scholars that the very visible Iranian diaspora and their voices, like in the UK, in London, in France, in many countries of the West, Iranians who are there, who are living there on exile, they were very happy about American action. They were having, they were going on the streets. They were really enthusiastic about it. But we as scholars, we know that that's not the voice of Iranian people
There you go.
today.
There you go.
It's a very big difference. So you cannot base on the emotions of the diaspora while judging on what will happen in Iran itself. I've been to Iran 3 times myself, and I have to tell you, it's a very pro-Western society. But it does not mean that they want Shah back. It does not mean that they want any external power to rule in Iran. We are talking about a country who used to be a superpower itself. They don't want their own oil and gas to be controlled by the Americans. So that consolidates the people around the current regime. And it's far from what the diaspora would think about it. So that's one comment. And second, as far as Israel, I'm reading also this question. Israel is supported by the US, both military and financially. That's true. But I think, first of all, even if US withdraws directly from the Gulf, I mean, in a future, because that would be in accordance with the security strategy of US to be a bit less involved directly, it does not mean that it will be a cut with relations with Israel. It will continue. It will just be a difference that Israel will act itself as a major power in the region. But in the same time, I think the relationship between US as a country and Israel as a country will be still very strong, despite the differences of the leadership. Because obviously now we have 2 completely, how to say, radical leaders, both Netanyahu and Trump. So that's a very, very special situation. Netanyahu will not rule Israel forever. Also, Trump will not rule in the US forever. So maybe the dynamics in details will change, but I don't think US will give up the presence in the Gulf through Israel, which obviously poses a question also to the other countries in the region, which before the problem in Gaza and the attack of Hamas, and before the war of Israel and US against Iran, they were willing to normalize the situation with Israel. First, Saudi Arabia, but also before it was Abraham Accords signed physically by Emirates and by Bahrain. So now for these countries, it's more difficult, or it was more difficult to do it after Hamas attack. But now, because of Iran, it's against a different situation, because Iran is seen now as an enemy number 1 of the whole region, while it wasn't the case so obviously earlier. So I would be myself curious to see what will be the final dynamics in between the countries of the Gulf, having from one side Iran, which is now number 1 enemy because they were hit directly by Iranian missiles. Don't forget about that. So they are angry. Countries like Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, they are angry with Iran for this situation. I don't think they expected that Iran will do this. But in the same time, because of Palestine, they are not so easily open to, to just shake hands with Israel.
Yeah. Interesting point. Mark, it seems you have a lot to say.
Yeah, well, I want to go back to the question, and I have some pushback on the Israel question. I think that maybe it might be a conflated view of Israel's position in the region, but the question about the Western-backed overthrow of Iran's leadership in 1953. I think that's a really good one because it was an action that was put together by British intelligence and the CIA, and it was simply, this idea, or at least in Iran, it was that, hey, you can't nationalize your own oil industry, and um, the the consequences of the overthrow of that 1953 coup, um, it it led to the 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 restoration of the Shah and his largely authoritarian backed but Western backed governance. And that irritated a lot of the Iranian population. And then, of course, provided a kind of grievance for the 79 revolution. But the bigger picture here is that there's a resonance to what happened in 1953 and in 1979, is that there's this narrative, a kind of nationalism that, hey, Western powers are always interested in undermining Iranian sovereignty, whether that means, for energy interests or simply to exploit their own strategic interests in the region. And people claim that, hey, this has a lot of historical there's a lot of historical basis for this. Uh, and the hardliners in Iran always go back to 1953 to say that, hey, this is a pattern that you started, and that all of these things, the collapse of the nuclear deal in 2025 and 2026, is just a sign that we can't trust you. We never can trust you. We never will trust you, and that um, um, this, to a certain extent, acts as a source of legitimate grievance on the part of the Iranian regime. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I really don't. That's part of it. I don't think it's the whole thing. And I already talked about regime change before, but I would like to talk a little bit about Israel. And I think Israel has badly misplayed its hand in the region. I think that, coming into 2024, um, Netanyahu was politically toxic and politically weak. This is a guy who has been the subject of a political censure and threats on the removal from power. There were multiple elections in Israel where essentially, the Likud party had shrunk. Um, some people have speculated essentially that, one of the reasons why Netanyahu escalated tensions in Lebanon and escalated tensions in Gaza and pursued essentially a genocide of the Palestinian people was to cement a legitimacy, a hold on power. But Iran, Iran faces another challenge, and of course, Lebanon too, because Israel is there now as well. Uh, in a very, very grave predicament because one, it can't afford essentially a three-pronged war. It's just recovering from, the Gaza debacle. It's in Lebanon and it's supporting U.S. action in Iran. There are already socioeconomic consequences of this. And even the IDF itself is facing a kind of attrition where reservists, for example, aren't showing up for duty. People are actively protesting this idea that, oh, here we go. My youth, my life is upended by Netanyahu's, political power grab or his sort of, thirst for war. And the number of casualties, the detrimental effects that war can bring, not the cost, in terms of blood, but expense on the Israeli economy, on psychosocial care, medical care, right? All those sorts of things that we don't really count as a cost of war. They are going to come bearing down on Israel. And like we like to say with as we talked about with the EU and other Western partners, you cannot rely on the United States. That has been a kind of theme to some of the points we're talking about.
Right.
It's completely unpredictable. It acts irrationally, and Trump is nothing but irrational. He's very emotional to a certain extent. He's the idiot smart man, as I would like to say. But the United States will pivot. It will, at one time, as the previous speaker said, it will return to a state of normalcy, and Trump will not be in office forever. And to a certain extent, that will exhaust Israel. It will cost its capacity to wage war when the United States has to pull back, has to retreat, refuses to engage in these kinds of preemptive conflicts or support Israel in its own preemptive conflicts. And what will eventually occur is Israel comes out of this much, much worse off, much, much more vulnerable. And you find, to a certain degree, Israel not necessarily alone, but more alone than it has ever been in quite a very, very long time. Because it hasn't happened yet, but you can imagine the blowback from these conflicts is coming.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Sarabjeet, you have, I'm sure, more from the maritime point of view. You would like to throw some lights on this.
Absolutely. So there was an issue on insurance, which I'll cover. But let's remember that Iran has been preparing for this day for at least 2
Very
decades.
long time.
And the resilience of this governance structure in Iran is just proving hard to break. And my understanding is that the present people who are left leading Iran are hardliners. They are not going to go quietly into the night. Not that earlier also Iran would have got called quietly into the night. So, but the question is that, we have been looking at the Persian Gulf as a hotspot. And all nations and navies worth their salt have actually game played or planned that if something like this goes down, what is it that we are going to do? There is obviously no regional consensus on what is to be done. The nations are looking at their own supply of energy, how to just get out of this situation as it is right now, and then perhaps look at tomorrow, day after. There is no regional or a global consensus on how to go about this. All right. And then, of course, do remember, the US was never interested in coming into this region. Olaf Caro, the wells of power, the term he used, and sort of forced the US to come in here. And then, of course, the twin pillar policy of the US fell aside. It's already been discussed. But when you look at the maritime issue, and I just saw one question on the same happened in Bab el Mandab. So what's happening now is that when you look at the insurance issue, and do remember during the tanker wars, the insurances again went through the roof. But because it was more of an in-house conflict between Iran and Iraq, the methodology used by nations was different. So the US put its own flag temporarily on the oil tank or the tankers of other nations in the Persian Gulf, and that gave it the legitimacy to protect. Here, who's going to protect neutral shipping? Right. So as far as insurance is concerned, there's a 3-4 layered insurance game out here. And the basic root of all the insurances as to who's finally insuring the insurer who insures the insurer who insures the ship.
There you go.
The base is US. So even during Piracy 1.0, if I would remind you, even Lloyd's came under a cloud because the only institution or the only industry that benefits from all this is the insurance industry. So this is, I think, more of another game plan in the offing is that, I don't think it's working out well. Because it's, as I said, I mean, the game plan which nations envisage that perhaps this would work out is not happening. So now they're stuck. And they've not even left, a rear windowed or an off-ramp solution as to how do you get out of this. So they're stuck. So the US is with its back to the wall. To my mind, the senior player in all this is Israel, and Dr. Cogan has covered what Israel is facing. And if you do remember, when the cease 15-point peace proposal was given by the US in end March, and I had a discussion with some Israeli analysts that saying, all right, by end March, this will all be over, and Israel would have achieved its aim. It hasn't happened because Iran said, you got 15 points, here are my 5 points. None of those 5 points would have been acceptable to Israel. US may have said yes, but definitely not Israel.
Yeah.
So now there is no off ramp, there is no solution in the offing. So you're getting more and more stuck in this quagmire.
Yeah.
But what is happening is that now the global pressure on the energy crisis is slowly building up. If you don't get your crude oil and gas out, that is one industry which is hit, but there is a lot of petroleum products that the world thrives upon, which is taken from this crude oil. And just to remind you, India processes crude oil, and our petroleum products, which we export, accounts for 17% of our GDP, which is a huge figure.
Cooking
And where
oil.
does this go? It all goes to Europe and the US. So there is, the tentacles of the octopus. It's more than 8 limbs pushing out. There are multiple tentacles that are impacting global economies, right? So is there a solution in the offing? The only solution is that, stop the conflict, stop killing each other, whether it's even proxies involved, and come to the table and negotiate for the betterment of world economy. Because this region is going to take at least a couple of years, around 5-6, to regain the amount of oil, energy, and that used to flow out of it. But it has opened the floodgates for alternate options. And the Bab el-Manda issue is that one question being asked is, why are the Houthis quiet? The Houthis were so active during Piracy 2.0, and of course, there are indications that Piracy 2.0 was also funded by the Houthis, and the roots and the fingers point back to Iran, to develop this up. So, these are tigers. These are tigers by the tail. Once you get hold of it, you just can't let it go. So, why are the Houthis quiet? There is the UAE angle also in all this.
Right.
Interesting,
Right.
but complex scenario.
Very, very.
So it's complex. So there is no solution in the offing. The only solution is put down your weapons, stop firing missiles, don't launch any drones. Drones, come to the table. Let's talk. All right. Who's going to benefit from all this? It's Russia, China, because they're going laughing to the bank. And yeah. So there you are. So if you're looking at a regime change in Iran, I don't think that is the solution.
No.
Dr. Cogan mentioned Libya and Iraq. I mean, I'm not sure if West Asia is ready to have this turmoil going on for many years to come. Perhaps it was stabler.
So in fact, you could see the effect on UAE economy. UAE is really upset, and it's not really the Gulf economy. If you see, each of this case is very special. UAE's case, it's every hour matters. The flight transaction, Dubai, Abu Dhabi as the commercial and the air route, each one of them are getting affected. Qatar. I could see, Małgorzata, you are raising hand, but what I would see is that maybe Isak, you could just club some of these questions together in 1 or 2 minutes. Then we would ask each one of them to maybe address some of these questions in 1 minute each or a couple of minutes each. I must say that I have another engagement, so we need to end sharply at 2 o'clock CET time. So Isak, over to you to read some of these questions as much as you could. Otherwise, most of our participants, they can email to some of our speakers. So over to you, Isak.
Yeah, of course. So I have actually a question here for Małgorzata. It was addressed by Elif earlier. When you mentioned that Israel now stands as the strongest in the region in terms of hard power, I thought about the financial sources that feeds the power. The US provides immense military and financial aid to Israel. In the future, if the US is unable or unwilling to continue that aid, how much hard power can Israel keep? And then I had a couple of questions related to energy, because I saw a few of them actually. So I'm going to combine 2 of them because they're somewhat related to each other. But the first one was asked by Akash Pawar. This question is open to all the panel members. How do you think the situation in Hormuz has affected international calculations regarding energy security? Is there likely to be a massive accelerated push towards alternative energy sources as a result, e.g. nuclear, solar? I might like to add a little bit to the question, how feasible is it by maybe in 4 years or by 2030 to insulate countries from these sort of conflicts or escalations in and around Hormuz? And associated with that, Koshbaya asked, how far would Japan be willing to align with Washington if doing so risks damaging its economic relationships with China and its broader ties with the Gulf states? Would Tokyo prioritize alliance obligations or energy security? And I suppose you could include not just Japan, but also the European Union and India in your responses.
Right. No, Isak, thank you very much for reading out some of these questions. Very interesting. I wish we have more time to take more questions, but unfortunately, due to the constraint of time, we'll just take some of these questions. So I'll go in this order. First, Małgorzata, then Mark, then Sarabjeet. So each one of you just strictly two minutes. So we'll have 6 to 8 minutes, and then we'll end. So we'll start with you, Małgorzata.
As far as Israel, number one, I don't think US will stop financing or helping Israel. But what can happen if there is another president in the US, and especially if there is a change of the leadership in Israel, is that the US will try to push Israel, not Israel will try to push the US. That's a very important change, that Israel has to take into consideration the American position and the pressure the American presidents can have over Israel. So it may change towards more power who would control itself. As far as Israel is concerned, I think the radicalization of the public opinion and politicians is really a big problem for Israel. In the long run, I agree that Israel is losing as far as perception, as far as, somehow PR, but it does not change the radical approach of the people. And this radical approach wants to finish off once and for good the problems Israel has been having for all these years. They are having this approach, if not now, then never. Now is the time. Let's finish off all our enemies. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, etc. And obviously, this kind of approach is good for Netanyahu because it still mobilizes the society. Don't forget, Netanyahu was hated, and it was very, very, possible that he should be in jail. But with this situation, he has a mandate to continue because, in a way, he follows what his nation is thinking. I am stressing the fact that the Israeli population has changed also from the point of view of demographics because of a huge wave of immigrants from Russia. And I think this kind of a Bolshevik approach is very, very well sensed in the Israeli population. It had an impact. The Russian Jews, who I'm talking about 600,000, it's a big number, who immigrated to Israel, changed the dynamics in this country. And as far as other points, not only Strait of Hormuz, my comment would be that Strait of Hormuz blockade is a very good lesson for all other places which are, on the spot and on the radar today, because it shows that these places could be blocked, could be used instrumentally. So it is, I think the consequences of the Strait of Hormuz blockade is not only for this particular place, it will be a huge impact on it generally rethinking the world architecture of trade. And I think which is already happening, the companies, the business who was going with, no worries through all these points on the map who are so important. Now they do calculations and they are trying to see what could be the alternatives, because they don't want to find themselves in the situation like that. So it may have consequences much larger than for this particular point on the map.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I would like to, since I'm here in Japan, I think I could talk about Japan and Japanese energy security. Well, one thing is that Japan has taken very proactive steps to reach out to Iran. And if you'll remember that Takeichi kind of got on the wrong side of Trump by suggesting that, he is not going to, she's not going to get involved in this conflict, and that she's constitutionally restricted in sending anyone any kind of force, the MSDF there. But Japan has no choice but to maintain an open dialogue with Iran, and that's one of the great characteristics of Japanese foreign policy is that it's very good at dialogue. It's very good at bilateral diplomacy. So. While other parts of the world, other parts of Asia are struggling, Japan was able to secure like 60% of its alternative energy supply of crude, bypassing or through the Strait of Hormuz. And it allowed, in turn, Iran allowed the Japanese ships to pass. But there's another recent development, I think, that's really, really important, which is the updated FOIP, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, where when she went to Vietnam and she went to Australia, one of the things that she was saying was that, look, we not only need to focus on economic infrastructure, we've got to talk about, artificial intelligence and all this other stuff, but we need to foster greater sort of public-private cooperation, and most importantly, supply chain and economic resilience. And that means not only crude oil, but it means other sources of energy and critical materials. And that also means like mineral recycling. So, yeah, in the short term, I mean, as one speaker said, you're not going to get over, I think the captain said this, you're not going to get over this in the next 5 to 6 years. But being proactive and saying, hey, we can recycle minerals and we can be proactive in developing partnerships, particularly within Southeast Asia. That's really important. And her dialogue in Vietnam I think was pretty well received, and Japan actually said that it would supply several $billion in energy assistance to countries that are struggling, which is saying, hey, another thing that Japan's good at is being, hey, we are an alternate, reliable partner. When, say, the United States fails, Japan is here. I believe there was a quote by the Thai foreign minister a few days ago, maybe a week ago, talking about the Hormuz crisis, where the Thai foreign minister basically said, hey, the United States has not offered us any help whatsoever. We are on our own. We are completely lost here. But didn't take the Japanese much longer to reach out and suggest an alternative course of action. That's a really, really important thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Sarabjeet, quickly, we are
quickly. So this alternate sources of energy, it's a totally different dynamic. I mean, we've been hearing for clean and green energy, I think, for the last decade and a half. And if nations have not stepped on that accelerator, it's going to take a long time. And do remember that dynamics and internal industries change. If you are going to change your source of energy, anything that is driven by the old energy needs to change. And first of all, that comes to mind is vehicles. Do you think car manufacturing is going to change? I mean, it's an uphill task. That's one issue. But I'd like to, bring out that the complexity which we are facing, and if you would, for those of you who have followed the statements coming from various nations, we had the Indonesian finance minister around a week back, I think, saying that Indonesia is considering toll for passage through Malacca Strait, and immediately the External Affairs Minister of Indonesia said, we don't have any such ideas to do. Now, this is, it raises questions. And why? Because Indonesia is sitting atop 6 of those straits that are dotting the Indian Ocean region. So how nations will react, what will they do, what will they say. This is opening a whole new Pandora's box, which means that do we just burn or unclose and get back to the olden days where we didn't have unclose and just try to, run our own private laws and conventions and stick by it. But this is still just a developing area. But more importantly, Donald Trump is going to China, I think 14th, 15th May are the dates. Now, it's a little strange that you're visiting a country who's friendly to the country with whom you're in conflict. I'm not sure what sort of a signal that sends, and I'm sure Xi Jinping is going to be damn kicked about it. We've got Donald Trump coming to our country while we are feeding Iran. Taiwan is definitely number one on the agenda, but it'll be nice to see what happens about the Strait of Hormuz and are there any discussions? And does China take any concessions from the US insofar as energy supply goes? It'll be interesting to see the result of that meeting. And I'll stop here.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you. I think these are very useful discussion, and I think it was really very thought-provoking to have a multiple perspective from different experts. And I think we had really some interesting comments and questions. I hope we have more time, but again, when you discuss some topics like this, no matter how long you discuss, you keep on, wondering if we have always more time. But let me thank all of you, Małgorzata, Mark, and Sarabjeet, for your useful comments and for being here. And also to all of our participants, YCAPS, ISDP, and from elsewhere you have joined to listen. Thank you very much. We'll continue our webinar series between YCAPS and ISDP in the Europe-Asia series. And of course, we are going to discuss some of the other issues, Bab el Mandab choke, and also going forward on the Strait of Malacca also. With this note now, let me hand over to Isak and to our YCAPS colleagues, Vittori, if they have anything to offer.
I just want to say thank you everybody who participated in this webinar, and thank you to all the speakers and Jagannath. And I just want to give a heads up to anybody who's in Japan. We have some events coming up in May. An introduction to judo for anybody who's interested in that, it'll be online, and then we have an actual in-person event that takes place. We'll also have a book talk on Eurasian maritime geopolitics coming on May 13th, as well as another YCAPS community conversations on May 19th on how Nixon's deal with China triggered Japan-US alliance transformation. So if you're in the area around Yokosuka or Japan or Tokyo, feel free to join us. Other than that, I'd like again to thank all the participants who joined, and I'd like to say good evening and good night to everybody in Japan, and good day to everybody else in Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.